Welcome. Thank you all for joining us for our final ArtBreak of 2024. I don't know where the time has gone. Just a quick reminder that in the new year, we will be moving this program to Wednesdays. So our first ArtBreak of 2025 will take place on Wednesday, January 15th. And this will be featuring painter Mary Hatch and poet Elizabeth Kurlikowski, who have recently published their third co-authored book called Falling Women. On January 16th, we'll gather in the galleries for Movement in the Museum, which is our popular annual collaboration with Wellspring Dance. Dancers will make their way through the space, responding to works and legendary voices through movement. The program starts at 6 p.m. and will include a talk back with the dancers afterwards. We also have a gallery gathering coming up on January 9th in response to Roscoe Hall's With Great Intent to Leave It All for You and Tylon Sawyer's American Woman, Columbia. Please also stay tuned for updated information on the gallery gathering and the poetry workshop that were originally scheduled for last Thursday evening and had to be rescheduled due to weather. We intend to get that information out to you very soon. It is now my honor to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Dennis J. Frost. Dr. Frost is the Wen Chao Chen Professor of East Asian Social Sciences at Kalamazoo College, where he teaches courses on the entire scope of pre-modern, modern, and contemporary East Asian history. He received his Ph.D. in 2007 from Columbia University, specializing in modern Japanese history. He has written widely on Japanese history, including his books Seeing Stars, Sports Celebrity, Identity, and Body Culture in Modern Japan, and More Than Medals, A History of the Paralympics and Disability Sports in Postwar Japan. In conjunction with our exhibition, Powerful Forces in the Joy Light Gallery, he joins us today to speak about samurai in history and myth. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dennis Frost.
All right, can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. Well, thank you, Dr. Thomas, for the kind introduction and the invitation to speak today. And thank you to all of you who are here. It's not as chilly as a normal December day might be, but it's still chilly. So thanks for coming out. And to those of you watching the live stream, I appreciate that as well. I'm delighted to be here today to share a little bit about the rich and fascinating history of the samurai in Japan. One of the things I wanted to mention right at the outset is that throughout my presentation today, I'll be using the westernized or Americanized version of the pronunciation of the word samurai. If we were using Japanese, it would be samurai. But what's happened is the word samurai has become so common and familiar in English that it's not really a foreign word anymore. And in some ways, that commonness is kind of the point. And a big part of, I suspect, what brings many of you here today. Because I'm assuming that many of, if not most of you, are like a lot of my students at Kalamazoo College and other places I've taught. And what I mean by that is that you have some familiarity with the samurai, even if you haven't had a chance to learn about them and study their history more formally. After many years of teaching about the samurai, what I've discovered is that what most people know about the samurai is in fact more a matter of myth than it is a case of history. And those myths have become familiar largely because of people's exposure to popular culture, including what I think is the latest example of this, and maybe some of you have seen this, the prize-winning, and I think very good, actually, and I'm a historian, so that's a good critique here. So the new show series called Shogun, based, of course, on the novel from earlier. Today, what I'd like to do is take a few minutes to examine what I see as a top 10 list of common myths about the samurai. We'll start with a few broad points that we need to kind of keep in mind as we think about the samurai more generally. Then I'll move kind of mostly chronologically through samurai history, and as I do so, we'll unpack each of those 10 myths. For each myth, I'll try to offer at least a general sense of how it relates to the actual history of the samurai here. I'll conclude today with a few brief thoughts on why these myths are so common, especially in our understandings of samurai today. Now, unfortunately, I only have about 30 minutes. They wouldn't let me do like a 10-month session for you, but I have 30 minutes, so I don't have time to cover all of the history and dig too deeply into the history of the samurai. But hopefully today's talk will inspire you to look more in detail into that history yourself on your own. And of course, I'll be happy to expand on specific points once we get into the question and answer session. Now, before diving into our exploration of the myths of samurai, I want to mention two foundational points about the samurai that are critical to kind of understand at the outset of any discussion when we're talking about the samurai. And first is a point that I think it might sound a little silly, but it's really important. And that's the fact that in Japan, warriors were warriors before they were samurai. What I'm driving at here is that samurai was not a word for warrior per se, but was a unique and specific status category within Japanese society. And as a side note, I would mention that this status category included not just men, but also children and women. And by status and a status category, what I'm referring to is a distinct social category. Another way to think of this that might make sense for us today, and at least works in kind of a common way, is we could think of this as a distinct class, or maybe even a caste of people that Japanese society associated with particular things. And this brings us to our second kind of foundational point. Even though Japan had warriors or other people who fought in conflicts well before the samurai existed, and even long after the samurai existed, the distinct status category of samurai emerged at a very specific point. Well, not so specific, but because it emerged and began taking shape in the 900s. So that's specific in the sense of this time period that we're going to talk about today. And once this status category emerged, it continued to exist all the way until that category was formally abolished in the 1870s. What that means is that the status category of samurai existed for 900 years. That's a really long time. And here I would introduce the very first of our myths. And that is the fact that samurai were bound to tradition and thus unchanging. Now, if I were to tell all of you that life and people in the United States had not changed since the 1100s, I'm sure all of you would respond that that is the most ridiculous thing you've ever heard. Because the United States didn't exist. I don't think I have to tell you all that, right? In the 1100s. But yeah, it was 600 years later that the country finally emerged. So things have obviously changed in 900 years. In the same way, in Japan, it's important to realize that over that 900-year history, where the status category of samurai existed, the people in this category experienced dramatic changes. And this means that we cannot simply assume that a samurai at one point in history was like a samurai in a different point in history. How samurai lived, how they defined themselves, all of this was constantly changing as they responded to the changing world around them. A nice example of this point is myth number 2. Because I bet if I asked you what the weapon of choice for a samurai is, you would all say a sword. Setting aside the fact that samurai women often trained with different weapons, and that samurai also used guns at various points in their history, especially the later history. If we look at the very earliest samurai that were emerging in the 900s, what defined them as a distinct social category was the fact that they were professional, mounted archers who owned land. And I'll repeat that. Professional, mounted archers who owned land. What word did I not say? Swordsmen, right? They had swords, but they were not the weapons that early samurai were associated with in society. And here, as an example here, we have an artist picture of a samurai, famous samurai from the 1300s. As you can see here, what generates the kind of a lot of attention from the artist is our horse. He's got a bow. He's got his arrows. He does have a sword, but it's definitely not the weapon he's using. And I would say it's not even really the focal point of this image at all. We have also lots of early literary accounts of the samurai, and these are filled with detailed descriptions of the samurai's horses, right down to their names. And also the descriptions of the bows, which were often decorated, and their arrows. Swords, on the other hand, are barely mentioned at all, and when they are, it's when they're being used in a very practical sense, usually for cutting people's heads off. The more specific connection between swords and samurai is a much later phenomenon, resulting from several historical changes. And I'll come back to that point in a little bit later. For our third myth, we can look at another thing that is often said to define samurai, an obsession with honor. This idea is one that on its surface would seem to give credence to the earlier myth that samurai were unchanging. Because when we look at samurai in different periods of time, what we do see is that many of them were talking and writing and thinking a lot about this question of honor. They tended to use different words, but it was all kind of words that we might associate it with honor. That said, when I think about honor for the samurai, when I often talk about honor for the samurai with my students, one of the things that it makes me think of automatically is my coffee cup, or a coffee cup. I will say I do not have this coffee cup. It would be kind of weird. But so what I'm getting at here is the fact that this is a coffee cup, right? It has a spoon in it, and it has what else in it? Can I fill it with coffee? I can fill it with water. I can fill it with hot chocolate. I can fill it with bourbon. But when I tell you it's a coffee cup, you all understand immediately what I'm talking about, right? It's the same way for samurai when it comes to honor. They were all using the same words, and everybody thought they understood exactly what they meant at different points in time. They're using this idea of honor. The thing is, what they were doing was filling it with different stuff. Some of them were filling it with bourbon, quite literally probably, or not bourbon, but sake, but some of them were filling it with other stuff. And so honor tended to be very subjective. We actually have lots of examples of and stories of samurai doing things like cheating, stealing, cold-blooded murdering of people. Things that don't seem very honorable on their surface, but in the context of specific times, they were actually praised as the honorable action. A good example of this is if you had a chance to see the exhibit, there's several paintings related to the 47 Ronin. These men are seen in some circles as some of the most honorable examples of Japanese samurai ever. They're from the 1600s, or actually the 1700s, sorry. But when we look at what they actually did, they broke into a man's house in the middle of the night and murdered him and many of the people that worked for him. Not a particularly honorable action until you think about the context in which it was involved. So when we actually think about honor and what it meant, if we're kind of seeing this as the defining element of the samurai, one of the things we need to realize is that honor was extremely individualized and dependent on the socio-historical context in which it was playing out. And this ties us into our fourth myth about the samurai. And this is one you may have heard as well, that samurai were avid practitioners of Zen. So part of what complicates this myth here is that Zen was not popularized in Japan until the 1200s, so about 300 years after the samurai first emerged. So it clearly doesn't fit with our earliest samurai. That said, part of Zen's success in Japan did in fact stem from support from high-ranking samurai, beginning in the 1200s. And throughout samurai history, there were certainly many warriors who did in fact have a devotion to Zen and Zen teachings. But in general, explorations of samurai and religion show us that, like many others in Japan, samurai regularly adopted a diverse, pragmatic, and syncretic approach to religion. Some samurai were devotees of Shinto sects and Shinto deities. Others pursued beliefs from a wide range of Buddhist sects aside from Zen. In fact, I would say that probably that was true of more samurai than was the case with Zen. In the 1500s, there were samurai who became Christians. And we know that samurai engaged with a whole range of religious cults as well as localized shamanistic practices. Even in the life of a single samurai, it was common for them to hold and pursue multiple religious beliefs and experiences. So as with honor, what we see is that religious beliefs were highly individualistic and contextualized. A fifth myth, which is often associated with Zen, is the notion that samurai lived lives of intense discipline and focus. And there are countless examples of samurai who might embody this ideal. But there are also countless examples of samurai, particularly in the later periods, who spent their lives in debauchery. Many of the shoguns were famous for their lavish parties, with some even building boats, very large boats, just for the purpose of having parties. And countless numbers of samurai from all ranks spent every last penny they had and then went out and borrowed some more money so that they could spend their days eating, drinking, carousing, and pursuing sexual gratification in the pleasure quarters. Indeed, social critics in later periods, many of whom were samurai themselves, often lamented the fact that samurai had lost their way and were no longer concerned about their honor. And it wasn't unusual for families to lock up disruptive relatives in cages in their homes to keep them from continuing actions that might bring shame to the family. And this brings me to a sixth myth, since I'm sure that many of you are familiar with what samurai were supposed to do when they had been dishonored. According to many people's understandings, in cases of defeat or other forms of dishonor, all samurai killed themselves by seppuku, a form of ritual suicide also known as harakiri, which involved a person stabbing themselves in the abdomen and then cutting their belly open to disembowel themselves. Seppuku was indeed a very important element of samurai honor culture. And in some ways, it's really, really complex, so I can't fully unpack the significance with our limited time today. But I wanted to highlight a couple of points about it. First, it was not always part of samurai culture. There are minimal references to seppuku before the 1300s. And by the 1700s, it wasn't so much a method of suicide as a form of capital punishment reserved for people in the samurai status category. Second, considering the grand scope of samurai history and the millions of people in that status category during the 900 years that they existed, seppuku was actually quite rare. There were certainly time periods and instances where it occurred more frequently, and we know that from the records. But as I noted just a moment ago, even in cases where a family member had clearly dishonored themselves and was in danger of dishonoring their family, it was much more common for the family to just lock them up or to find other ways to punish them rather than having them commit seppuku. In that 900-year history of the samurai, the vast majority of samurai would have died from natural causes. Non-seppuku battle wounds and battle-related deaths probably came a pretty distant second. And I would go so far, and I don't know, I'm not a historian of seppuku specifically, but I would go so far as to suggest that a big part of why seppuku received attention at the time and since is because it was really quite exceptional when it did happen. Seppuku is often tied directly to a seventh myth, that samurai always fought to the death, either at the hand of their enemy or at their own hands. Early tales of the samurai from the 900s do tell us that figures like Taira Masakado did fight to the last, falling in battle after being struck by an arrow from one of his enemies. But those very same tales about Taira Masakado also reveal that prior to his death, Taira Masakado had regularly fled the battlefield in order to live and fight another day. And even as he was fleeing the battlefield in those situations, his honorable reputation remained intact because he came back and fought again. Later samurai history is full of similar stories, including accounts of leaders like Tokugawa Ieyasu. He's actually the model for Toranaga in the Shogun series, if you're interested. But Tokugawa Ieyasu was captured in war and went on to have an illustrious career. So he did definitely not fight to the death. We also know that Taira Masakado, our previous example, his final battlefield loss stemmed in no small part from the desertion of several men who had pledged to support him. So those people clearly did not fight to the death. We also know that Tokugawa Ieyasu's major victory came about from a similar situation where other people who had pledged to someone else joined him. Also, those people probably did not fight to the death. And this brings us to myth number 8, that samurai were always loyal to their lord, fighting for him or otherwise serving him until their death. As I've just indicated, loyalty of samurai was not necessarily a given. History also tells us that even family couldn't be fully trusted. Minamoto Yoritomo, who would later become the leader of Japan's first samurai government in 1185, first ordered his half-brother Yoshitsune to defeat and kill his cousin. And then, later, Yoritomo turned on his half-brother Yoshitsune and had him hunted down and killed. Great example of loyalty. Ashikaga Takauji, who we've already seen, is another case in point. He became shogun by joining an imperial uprising in 1333. In doing so, he betrayed and then defeated the previous shogun And then Ashikaga turned on the emperor he had just joined in defeating the other shogun, turned on that emperor, defeated him in battle, and then became shogun. Another great case of loyalty. There are also countless stories of lower ranking samurai who changed sides whenever a better opportunity presented itself. Thinking back to one of our earlier myths about honor, there were many instances where being disloyal was actually conceived as the most honorable thing to do, because it would bring further glory to you and to your family. Looking over samurai history, what we see is that loyalty tended to be highly individualistic, and that it also tended to be most useful to a samurai when it was paired with winning in battle and the rewards that came with those victories. Unfortunately, for many samurai, things changed dramatically for them beginning in the 1600s, as Japan moved into an era of more than 200 years without major military conflict. Known as the Tokugawa period, this was a time of peace when even minor street brawls between individual samurai could merit very severe punishment. So no fighting at all. And this brings us to our ninth myth, that samurai were always fighting because their sole occupation was war. And I would just note here that when I ask my students what they think when they think of samurai, it's this: a guy in armor, right, ready to fight at a moment's notice. And in samurai history, there were definitely periods where conflict was endemic. And much of life for everyone, not just samurai, but everyone, centered around war. Perhaps the best example of this is the Warring Country period, when Japan experienced almost continuous civil wars from the 1450s through the 1590s, so 150, give or take, years of violence and war. But even in the midst of those very violent periods, samurai were often engaged in much more than conflict. For instance, from their earliest emergence, samurai had been defined by land ownership and land management. And this continued to be a key part of their identity up to and beyond the 1600s. Countless samurai also served administrative roles, ranging from tax collectors to government officials. What made the peaceful Tokugawa era different, this period from the 1600s on, is that, especially compared with earlier periods, is that the sheer lack of potential to prove oneself or change one's social standing by performance on the battlefield completely disappeared. Gradually, over the course of just really a couple of generations, all samurai in Japan in the Tokugawa era were converted from warriors fighting on the battlefield, getting paid for how many heads they could cut off, and that's actually literally how some cases how they were kind of their ranks were merited. They changed from that to becoming government bureaucrats living and working in their lord's castles. Their government war having no violence at all. As war became an increasingly distant memory, one of the few things that samurai had left to distinguish themselves from pretty much everybody else in Japanese society was that samurai alone were given the right to wear 2 swords all the time. So the association of samurai with swords that we talked about a little bit earlier is a direct legacy of the Tokugawa period, this time of peace, a period when, ironically, they were largely prevented from using those swords. In fact, when we look at the Tokugawa period, one of the things we see is that it was lots of restrictions even on killing peasants. Even killing dogs with your sword was forbidden at certain points in time. So you're not allowed to use the sword you have, but you have it, and that's what distinguishes you. This era of peace also provides insight on our 10th and final myth today. The myth that all samurai lived according to a code known as Bushido, which is often translated as the way of the warrior. According to this myth, Bushido is an ancient code dating to the earliest history of the samurai, and it guided samurai in life, battle, and death. It required samurai to live lives of honor, pursuing virtues of loyalty, righteousness, self-discipline, benevolence, courage, honesty, and respect. Failure to follow this code and live honorably required samurai to commit seppuku. In many respects, Bushido has become a kind of master myth of the samurai, one that our previous examples today should suggest is hard to see as kind of accurate on a surface level. And there are two main reasons why the Bushido myth has become particularly pervasive. The first has to do with the Tokugawa period. As samurai in that period struggled to come to terms with what it meant to be warriors without war, they began to redefine themselves. And because this was a time of peace, they had the time to think, to read, and to write, and to look back at history, and to pick out details that they liked about that history, and to kind of use that. The roots of this Bushido master myth then stem from the Tokugawa era identity crisis that most samurai were experiencing. And they also reflect the realities of that time period. In a period marked by efforts to maintain the status quo, the only option for most samurai to achieve honor at all was to be loyal, to be respectful, to be self-disciplined. You didn't have an opportunity to go out and kind of prove yourself on the battlefield. All you could do was follow the rules. Failure to do so could mean loss of samurai status, and it wasn't possible to necessarily find a new lord because they all had their warriors that they already needed. The second reason for Bushido's pervasiveness has to do with the immediate aftermath of the Tokugawa era. With the collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1868, Japan entered an era of rapid modernization, especially as the country fought desperately to fend off Western imperialism. The abolition of the samurai status group was one of many waves of change sweeping Japan in this era. And so too was the effort to create a modern sense of nationalism and define Japan's place in an increasingly connected world. Many people engaged in this process of change, and several began crafting new interpretations of Bushido that could apply to all Japanese, because this is an era of nationalism. In doing so, these people creating these new forms of Bushido intentionally neglected the exclusive nature of the samurai status group. And they also picked and chose elements from that long 900-year history that best fit the things they wanted to kind of talk about. In other words, they created a bunch of brand new myths about the samurai. A classic example of this cherry-picked and inaccurate version of New Bushido was the one produced by Nitobe Inazo, a Japanese Quaker educated in the United States. Nitobe's Bushido, the Soul of Japan, was first written and published in English, not Japanese, he wrote this in English, and was first published in 1899. And it continues to be one of the top-selling books on Japanese history on Amazon today. It's in the top 20, I think, if you add up all the different volumes. In this sense, this single problematic work has played a key role in shaping international myths about samurai, despite the fact that its history, its actual history of the samurai, is pretty dodgy. Even my students can pick that up when they read it. And they're not experts, by the way. So let me conclude today by bringing us back to where we started, that much of what people know about the samurai is in fact myth. Now, offering a much longer kind of exploration of why that's the case would take us well beyond the allotted time today. But we actually already kind of have a sense of why this has happened from our last myth of Bushido. Because even before the samurai were gone in the Tokugawa period, they were already actively creating myths about themselves. And then after that samurai status group was formally abolished in the 1870s, others picked that up and continued that process. Nitobe is a great example. There are lots of others besides him, and it continued even outside of Japan, especially since Nitobe wrote in English. There's a guy by the name of James Clavell who wrote a book called Shogun, another part of that myth making, and that became a mini-series, and now it's become a TV series, which is getting renewed for a second season. So we're seeing this myth-making process kind of continue. And part of what has aided all of these people that are kind of making these myths is that the samurai history itself is long, it's diverse, it's complex, it's messy. And in the end, one of the most remarkable things about the samurai, and a key, I think, to why they have such appeal and why they're so susceptible to kind of myth-making, is that all you have to do is a little historical digging, a couple of minutes online, do a little historical digging, apply some creativity, and you can turn samurai into just about anything you want them to be. You can turn them into idealized warriors. You can turn them into models for Japanese businessmen. You can turn them into models for Japanese baseball players. You can turn samurai into models for American CEOs. And there's lots of guidebooks that do this. So that's partly why we have these myths that are prevalent. We've got a long history, complex history, and it allows us to kind of do all sorts of stuff with them. Doesn't mean it's correct, but it's very interesting for sure. Thank you very much for your time and attention today. I will be excited to take your questions. Yes.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. Could you talk a little bit about Hagakure?
Hagakure. Yes, so he's asking about, it's a book that's actually produced in the Tokugawa period. It's a fascinating text in the sense that when it was written, it was actually not widely circulated. It was like there was one, because Japan was divided into lots of different domains. There's about 250 different, almost small countries within Japan in the Tokugawa period. And so only within the domain that it was produced in was kind of known at all. It's also a work, it's often described as kind of one of the early forms of Bushido. It's part of this myth making I was talking about. It's a samurai he's retired, he's frustrated with the world around him. He's one of the ones criticizing everybody because they're not living lives like proper samurai. He wants to go back to the good old days when samurai were samurai, when they got to kill people when they wanted and things like that. So yeah, it's a fascinating work. It's a great work of nostalgia in many ways that was reinvented and reappropriated in some ways in the post-samurai period, particularly in that era after. In the Meiji era, it doesn't really come back, which is the era right after the Tokugawa period. But in the wartime period, it's used by the Japanese state to promote kind of a particular, because it starts, one of the famous lines, I think it's maybe in the first line, the way of the warrior is the way of death. And it's meant to kind of cultivate that willingness to die on the part of Japanese soldiers. And so the Japanese military picks this up and uses it. It's another example of that myth making that's happening in different circles. So yeah, it's a really fascinating text. I think of it as, everybody's grumpy old uncle telling you about the good old days. And he has a whole the way the world should work kind of view of the world. I mean, it's somebody who did that and wrote that down. So yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating text. Yeah, fascinating history beyond the samurai too. Other questions? Yes. The Book of Five Rings is another work that comes out. It's actually written in the Tokugawa period. And it's Miyamoto Musashi, like his account of kind of how he's somebody who didn't fit in the world anymore. You could think of it that way. And he's writing up his account of like what it meant to be a samurai in this period. A lot of those versions of Bushido, like Book of Five Rings, Hagakure, there's a work called Shido. There's another version. There's all sorts of works that come out right around that time, between the 1600s and the 1700s, that are written, a lot of people kind of grappling with this new world order that they're kind of in. So it's relevant to the time period it's speaking in, but it's also been kind of picked up. It was used, Book of Five Rings, I have a translation in my office that professes to be the way that American business people can understand Japan, which is not at all what it was meant for. I mean, he was a warrior that didn't have any place to fight anymore. And famous, very famous warrior. Yeah. So it's similar to Hagakure in that sense. Yes.
I have a question about Yosuke, the Afro-Samurai warrior.
Yes.
Was that real or was that a myth? Or
That's a great question. So she's asking about Yasuke, who is, there's a new movie, I think, coming out. There's been a cartoon series, maybe animated series. This is it's set in the warring country period. And it's as far as I know, and I haven't dug deeply into this, it is based on the history of an actual warrior who arrived in Japan, I think with the Portuguese. I don't think he was a slave, but he was part of this crew, and then ends up kind of being picked up as a member of the fighting force for a guy named Oda Nobunaga, who was a very famous, one of the unifiers of Japan at the end of that warring country period. And so it is based on an actual character. Part of what, when you want to talk about myth making, part of what allows people to make myths is when we don't know much. Then you can kind of fill it with all sorts, it's the coffee cup, right? You can fill it with whatever you want. So I think that there's probably a lot of what we're seeing is people kind of filling that with stories that are kind of part of this broader samurai image, part of what they want to kind of talk about with And part of it is probably accurate in the sense that, there was a figure, he did fight for Oda Nobunaga. I honestly don't know much more than that, but yeah, it is based on an actual figure. So I saw another hand up. Okay, here, yes, don't.
You referenced the Shogun as being reasonably accurate as a historian. What about the vast canon of samurai movies? Is there one that you would say is a compelling story but has accuracy behind it? What do you think more the Kurosawa?
Yeah. I think it depends on what you're looking for. If you want, and it also depends on what time period it's referencing. Overwhelmingly, and I think this is probably right, Kurosawa, a lot of Kurosawa's films are set in the Tokugawa period. And so they get the setting, the vibe, I guess would be one way, that is kind of right. But he tends to, like, a lot of his warriors are Ronin. And there were Ronin, especially in the earlier part of the Tokugawa period. As you move on to the period, Ronin were less and less common because you kind of were locked in. You didn't want to become a Ronin because you had nothing left then. So there's a movie called Twilight Samurai, which is set in and I'm blanking on the director's name, but it is set in the end of the Tokugawa period when most samurai, most of the samurai were quite poor because they were deeply indebted, because they were given an annual stipend every year based on their rank and status, and that never increased. It was set in the 1600s, they set this rank and status and you get a stipend, which was pretty generous in the 1600s. But after about 200 years, inflation kicks in. And so it actually shows kind of the life of an everyday samurai. And the sword fighting scenes, I had a student that just watched it for a class on his own, and he said, it was really slow and boring. And the fighting scenes were really dark and not very interesting. That was kind of the point. But so that one I really like, but especially for that late Tokugawa period. Yeah, well, there's a lot of, depending on what you're thinking of, what you're looking for, right? And I think the Japanese, they call them jidaigeki, the time period pieces, right? Those, at least you're getting the costuming right and things like that. That's part of why Shogun works, the new Shogun. The earlier Shogun, and I did watch that. I'm young enough that I was actually initially sent out of the room and my parents started watching it. But I did end up watching it later. And that one is not great. But this new Shogun, they actually worked really closely with Japanese producers. Hiroyuki Sanada, who's the lead actor playing Toranaga, is very famous for doing a lot of Japanese samurai shows and films, and it had a direct role in a lot of stuff. So it's actually pretty well done. And so I think if you're looking at period pieces, you're getting all that stuff right. But it really does depend on the time period that it's set in and what you're looking for. There's a question over here, yeah.
It's not really clear to me how you get to be a samurai. Is it earned? Is it inherited? Is it bestowed on you?
It depends on the time period. So if you're talking in the early period of the samurai history, it tended to be a combination of both inherited title, but you could also get this. You would earn it for your military might. And there are moments in time where we see that being still the case. For example, in the Warring Country period, one of the other great unifiers was a guy by the name of Toyotomi Hideyoshi. And Hideyoshi started out life as a peasant and rises up through the ranks, and because he's actually really good at fighting and has good strategy and he ends up becoming one of the highest ranking. He ends up ruling Japan essentially as a samurai. So it was possible to enter the samurai status. Now, once you move into the Tokugawa period, everything kind of locks down, and your samurai status is strictly inherited. Now, one of the things I always tell my students is that the Tokugawa period is 250 years long, and so anything I tell you, you can find a contradiction for in that time period. Because one of the other things that happened is as the time period goes on and the samurai are running out of money, even the leaders of the domains, these territories, they're called daimyo, the head lords, were often short on cash and in debt to merchants. And so one of the ways they found to raise money was to sell samurai titles to merchants. So you could actually buy a samurai title later in life. And that's okay. This is the case with the Yasuke. He would have been given samurai status, and that was in that period where things were a little bit more in flux. There's also the famous example in Shogun is based on an actual figure named Will Adams, an English pilot on a Dutch ship that came in and actually did achieve samurai status during his lifetime and ended up staying in Japan, having a family in Japan, and things like that. There's a couple of good books about Will Adams if you're interested in that. There was another hand, I think over here, yes.
Do you feel that the block print traditions and depictions of the samurai played into the creations, mythic creations, or did they make more variations in some of these?
What a great question. So she was asking if the block prints, the ukiyo-e, the wood block prints, that there's several down in the exhibit. If you haven't seen the exhibit, it's terrific. I was down and seen it just a second ago. But if those prints contributed to the myth making or kind of did something else, and I would say they directly contributed to the myth making, both for the common population, because one of the things we know is that because it was a long period of peace, the literacy rate in Japan was remarkably high in the Tokugawa period, so that 1600 to 1860s. And so the common population was seeing these prints and reading about tales of samurai. Some of the famous literature that's produced in this is about tales of the samurai. It was written for the common population, but of course the samurai are reading it too, and the samurai are also kind of consuming these prints. So, and the kabuki, all of those art forms, like everything that was happening in that period was kind of contributing to this myth. One of the things that we didn't talk about when I talked about seppuku, the kind of ritual suicide, one of the ways that was probably popularized among the samurai is through war tales that were told by traveling bards that told stories of samurai who committed seppuku when they were kind of being about to lose in battle. And as those tales were going around, so you had this kind of practice in some ways reflecting the literary kind of traditions that were out there at the time. So I definitely think it was part of the myth making, and it wasn't necessarily samurai doing it. It was other people participating in but the samurai are kind of feeding on it too. And it contributes to that identity crisis for the samurai too. So great question. Let's see. Over here, and then we'll go back. Yeah.
So since there was an inherited component to it, and it was abolished status, are there today descendants of samurai that have some, or are there other kind of castes that exist in contemporary Japanese society?
So
obvious to me.
Yeah, so he was asking if this is an inherited status that then was abolished. Are there people that have kind of the continued samurai status, and are there other castes that we might kind of see in Japanese society? So it's funny. It's kind of like when you ask people like about if they're related to samurai. I've had lots of Japanese people be like, "Oh yeah, my family's samurai history has a samurai history." I'm like, which can't be true. But for everyone that almost everybody I've asked about that question specifically said yes, they have samurai history. I'm like, I'm skeptical of that claim. But yeah, there are definitely descendants of some of the famous, the Tokugawa clan, for instance, continue to exist. I remember reading some article about one of the most recent Tokugawa family members. Some of them ended up in, some of the higher ranking families ended up in kind of the Japanese government in the period after the abolition of the samurai. So there was a house of peers in Japan, and many of the peers were actually former samurai. I lived in northern Japan in a place called Morioka, which was part of Nambu Domain. And the family that ran Nambu Domain continued to be very influential locally right up to the time that I was living there in the early 2000s. So there are definitely kind of prestigious families. The other thing that part of what defined the Tokugawa period is that society was divided very strictly into kind of social hierarchies. So you had the samurai, of course, at the top, then you had peasants and merchants and artisans. There was also several outcast groups. And some of those outcast groups, officially, all those status categories were abolished in the 1870s. But what has happened is that some of those outcast groups continue to face discrimination today because they've inherited this kind of status to the extent that like many people would try and hide it. But then in Japan, you register your address as part of your family registration. And these categories were often dependent on kind of where you lived. And so a couple years ago, Google published some old maps or publicized some old maps online, and it revealed a bunch of old neighborhoods where these outcasts would live. And it led to kind of a new wave of discrimination against some of these people just because they happen to be in these neighborhoods. Some of these categories do kind of continue to kind of ripple through in different ways. So another question, I think was over, yes.
I just wondered about the stipend that you mentioned. How was that organized or paid? Where the money come from?
Oh, okay. So she was asking about the stipend, where it came from. So Japan in the Tokugawa period, and stipends are really kind of a development of the late warring country period and most of the Tokugawa period. So the period of peace. This is a society that's largely agrarian, and so everything is based on the amount of rice that is being produced in your territory. And so what they would do is they would determine you were given an allotment of land, because remember, samurai are still tied to land. You were given an allotment of land, but instead of living on that land, you now get the value of that land as a stipend. The amount of rice that is produced in that chunk of land is given to you as a stipend. And so those stipends, and it varied. Like, one of the other great things about the Tokugawa period is that I said there were 250 different countries. Each domain did it their own way. But in general, what happens is that those stipends are kind of set towards the beginning of the Tokugawa period by whatever administration is kind of running the show. And then they say, you are this rank, you get this much pay, this much stipend, you get this much land, but really now it's just a stipend. And then as time goes on, you can't increase that because you're stuck at that rank. There's no way to raise your rank. You're almost always kind of stuck where you are. Like, your grandfather's rank is your rank. Your grandfather's stipend is probably your stipend. So most samurai are pretty desperate by the time the Tokugawa period ends. Especially the lower ranking ones are really struggling. Does that kind of address? It's really complicated, but it's based on kind of amount of rice that's produced and in a particular chunk of land. Yes.
Going back to Kurosawa,
Mm-hmm.
there was a character, samurai that was portrayed by Mifune.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk to me about this? Is he revered in Japan? Do you revere him as a Kurosawa representative of what being a samurai might be?
So so this is a question about Mifune and whether he's kind of revered in Japan as a representation of samurai. He played a lot of different characters in Kurosawa films. I think he's actually even in Rashomon, which is actually because I'm a historian, I was required to watch it at multiple points in my history career. If you haven't seen Rashomon, I'll talk to you why later. But yeah, I think he is kind of seen as, when many people in Japan, I think of samurai, they think of Mifune, especially of a certain generation. I think that's shifted now because obviously there's a lot of different popular culture out there that people are more exposed to. But I think that a lot of people think of Mifune as what a samurai was. And a lot of his characters are that kind of wandering ronin, doing good. He's helping the people that are disadvantaged and things like that. And so it's definitely part of that myth making that is happening after the samurai are gone. But yeah, I think he was definitely conceived of as kind of, he's the samurai that people would come to jump into this one. Now, like I said, my students, nobody knows who he is. They all think of the guy in the armor. What's interesting, my students, none of them I had just taught the class this past fall, and none of them had seen the new Shogun show. I was blown away. I was like, I couldn't believe it. I suspected all of them would have seen it, but no. It's interesting how like television viewing is shifting these days. Was there any other questions? One here and then, yeah.
They talk a little bit about the samurai sword, in Aikido we practice samurai sword.
So he's asking a question about the samurai sword, and I will be completely honest and say, like, I am definitely not an expert on samurai swords. What I can tell you is that samurai swords were used by samurai, like, even in those earliest periods. So they did have swords, but they were definitely not the focal point. And the swords that they used, partly because they were mounted, you wouldn't like be sitting there pulling your sword out as you're riding, because you're not going to be able to reach the person. The other thing is that the armor that they were using would have been kind of impenetrable by the swords at the time, for the most part, especially from like if you're just kind of riding by really fast to hit somebody. And so we do have swords, and sword practice is something that like samurai become famous for, where we see a lot of, and I think you mentioned Aikido, is that what you're mentioned? The sword fighting? So a lot of what we think of as kind of the martial arts is tied specifically to the Tokugawa period, because the samurai were not fighting. They had no opportunity to use their swords. And they had a lot of free time on their hands. And so but they were also expected to still be trained. And so they would develop kind of schools. And so you see all these schools, and many of the samurai live in cities either the capital of Edo, the shogun's capital, or the castle, the domain town, which is castle town. So they live in cities, so there's lots of concentration of these people that are studying martial arts. So sword fighting, kendo, a lot of the stuff, it wasn't called kendo or aikido or judo or anything like that. Those are all more modern kind of forms that come out after the 1860s, 1870s. But you do see a lot of these kind of schools of training emerge, particularly in the Tokugawa period, where they have the time to kind of study, and there's a master, and like people come and pay him, and that's how this guy makes his money. And technically, those were all things that were supposed to be limited to the samurai, those martial skills. But one of the other things that's really interesting as we move toward the end of the period, we start seeing other groups of people that have money and time. And guess what? The master doesn't really care if he's getting paid. And so there are other people that aren't supposed to be practicing these martial skills that are doing so. So that's another kind of development happening. So I have one more question back here.
Your definition of shogun and ronin?
Oh, yes, sorry. Yeah, sometimes I tried really hard to keep the Japanese terms to a minimum here. The ronin is a masterless samurai. So a samurai that does not have a lord that he is serving. And so in different moments in time, that could mean something very different. In the Tokugawa period, it meant you were really on your own. Because if you didn't have a lord, you didn't have a stipend. So you had no income, no job, no place of specific residence. And if you were a samurai wandering around without those things, that could also get you in trouble. Because if you have 250 different countries, one of the other things to think about is that they didn't necessarily like people from other places coming into their territories. And so being a ronin could put you in kind of a very vulnerable position. So that's a master samurai is a ronin. The definition of shogun is the supreme military leader. It's often translated as, or one of the early translations for the term, it actually dates back to much earlier, like in the 900s, we have people being given this title. It's barbarian quelling generalissimo is one of the translations that I've read for it. What it is it's essentially the highest ranking military figure that the government is recognizing. And so early on, it was just kind of a term given to a high ranking general who'd done something good that the emperor wanted to reward him with. What happens in 1185 with Minamoto Yoritomo is that he is given this title after a series of kind of major conflicts. He's given this title, and then it becomes an inherited title that is passed on to his descendants. Because this is a distinct, separate military government called the shogunate. It's also known as the bakufu, another Japanese name for this. So but this is a military government distinct from the civilian government at that period. And so you have actually 3 official shogunates in Japan. There's the Minamoto shogunate, the Ashikaga shogunate, and then the Tokugawa shogunate. So 3 official shogunates that existed. Sorry, I dropped those terms in. Like I try not to do that, but it happens. Yes.
Doesn't the quality and strength of modern Japanese steelmaking have its origins in the steel of the sword? Because it has been molded so many times and has such sharpness. And I thought that was kind of the basis of the growth of this modern steelmaking.
I don't know enough about the swords and its connection to steelmaking. What I do, yeah. So the question is about the connection between sword making and the kind of high level of Japanese steelmaking today. And I don't know enough about them, but I do know that there were several regions in Japan that were especially famous for iron working, including the area where I lived up in northeastern Japan. And that they have a very long tradition. Even to this day, they're very famous for their cast iron kettles and things like that. And so so they have a long tradition of kind of iron working in that region. And there's several other places like that in Japan. Probably part of what they were making was swords, probably. Again, I don't know. But where the kind of modern stuff comes in is really after the end of the shogunate. And you see modern methods being brought in. They brought in and this is me remembering my American history, like the Bessemer process. Don't ask me for the details on that, but that came in really early in the kind of right after the end of the shogunate. And so they started making kind of modern steel really pretty quickly. And so probably it's a combination of pre-existing stuff happening in Japan combined with kind of this new influx of new ideas, and then the Japanese willingness to kind of spend extra time to make it as good as possible, right? Which is not necessarily a samurai value or related to swords or anything like that. But yeah. So I don't know specifics, but like I know there's some regions that are still very famous for their steel production that have a longer history of kind of working with iron and things like that. So it's probably connected in some way, but not definitely a direct link. Yes.
Can you define daimyo in context of shogunate?
Yes. So daimyo, as I said, is the name given to a landed lord who controls a group of men below him. And so in the context of the Tokugawa period, you had at the top of the kind of political structure, you have the shogun and all the people that are directly under him. And then you had approximately and it varied a little bit from time to time, but somewhere between 240, 250 daimyo, who are like slightly lesser lords, who also were ranked hierarchically. And these are all people that in the previous warring country period have been fighting with each other. And so one of the remarkable things that happens is you organize all these people into kind of a peaceful structure, so they're no longer fighting them for 200 plus years. And so the daimyo were ranked, and depending on how important you were as a daimyo, you had a bigger domain. And so, of course, the biggest chunks of land in Japan, and roughly it's kind of like, I want to say it's almost a third of all land in Japan was controlled by members of the Tokugawa family. So the rest of the 2/3 is divided between these 250 other lords. And what happens with them is in this period, you can't fight and you are looking for rewards. And so what happens with the daimyo is that they start competing, not on the battlefield anymore, but in terms of like, ooh, I want to sit closer to the shogun. If the shogun lets me sit like in this seat closer to him, that means I'm better than the guy behind me. And so they kind of redirect the energies of these people away from kind of the battlefield into more kind of peaceful. And so this is where a lot of that emphasis on self-discipline and respect and all those values, a lot of those values tied to Bushido, those work perfectly in the Tokugawa system. In some ways, you need them to get ahead. And so that's one of the things we see. Other questions? I don't know where we are in time, but good. Are we all right? Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your questions and the time today.